Relax and listen to the voice. Hello everyone, and welcome back once again to the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This marks volume 21 in our reading of the entire works of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. Please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and share this with your family and friends. Leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Alright, here we go. A string of pearls. The railroad in Denmark still extends only from Copenhagen to Korsør. It is a string of pearls. Europe has a wealth of these pearls. Its most costly are named Paris, London, Vienna, and Naples. And yet many a man will point out as his favorite pearl not one of these great cities, but rather some little country town that is still the home of homes to him, the home of those dearest to him. Yes, often it is not a town at all, but a single homestead, a little house hidden among green hedges, a place hardly visible as the train speeds by. How many pearls are there on the line from Copenhagen to Korsør? We will consider just 6, which most people must notice. Old memories and poetry itself give a luster to these pearls so that they shine in our thoughts. Near the hill where stands the palace of Frederick VI, the home of Oehlenschläger's childhood, one of those pearls glistens, sheltered by Sondermarken's woody ground. It used to be called the Cottage of Philemon and Baucis. Here lived Rabeck and his wife, Kama. Here, under their hospitable roof, assembled many of the generation's finest intellects from busy Copenhagen. It was the festival home of the intellectual. Now, don't say, "Ah, what a change!" No, it is still the home of the intellect, a conservatory for sick plants, for buds which do not have the strength to unfold their true beauty of color and form, or show the blossoming and fruit-bearing which is hidden within them. The insane asylum, surrounded by human love, is truly a spot of holiness, a hospital for the sick plants that shall someday be transplanted to bloom in the paradise of God. The weakest minds are assembled now here, where once the strongest and keenest met to exchange thoughts and ideas, but still the flame of generosity mounts heavenward from the cottage of Philemon and Baucis. Ancient Roskilde, the burial town of kings by Roar's spring, now lies before us. The slender towers of the church lift up above the low town and mirror themselves on Isefjord. Only one grave shall we seek here. It is not that of the mighty Queen Margaret. No, within the white-walled churchyard which we speed close by is the grave, and over it lays a small plain stone. The master of the organ, the reviver of the old Danish romances, rests here. We recall the clear waves rolled, and there dwelt a king in Lear. Roskilde, burial place of kings, in your pearl we see the insignificant gravestone whereon is cut a lyre and the name Ways. Now we reach Sigersted, near the town of Ringsted. The bed of the river is low here. Yellow corn waves over the spot where Hagbarth's boat lay at anchor, not far from Scene's maiden bower. Who does not know the legend of Hagbarth, who was hanged on the oak tree while the bower of Scene burst into flames? Who can forget that legend of immortal love? Beautiful sorrow, encircled by woods. Your quiet old cloistered town peeps out through its mossy trees. The keen eyes of youth from the academy can look across the lake toward the world's highway and hear the roar of the locomotive's dragon as it speeds through the woods. Sorrow, pearl of poetry, you are guarding the dust of Holberg. Your palace of learning stands beside the deep woodland lake like a great white swan, and nearby, like the bright starflower of the woods, there gleams a tiny cottage, whence pious hymns echo throughout the land. Words are spoken within, and the peasant listens and learns of Denmark's bygone days. As the song of the bird is to the green wood, so is Ingemen to sorrow. On to the town of Slagelse. What is mirrored here in this pearl's luster? Gone forever is the cloister of Antorskov. Vanished are the rich halls of the castle, even the last remaining wing. Yet one relic of olden times still lingers here, the wooden cross on the hill. It has been repaired again and again, for it marks the spot where legend tells us Saint Anders, holy priest of Slagelse, awoke after having been brought there from Jerusalem in a single night. Korsor, birthplace of Bagasin, master of words and wit. The ruined old ramparts of the fallen fortress are now the last visible witness of your childhood home. Their lengthening sunset shadows point to the spot where stood the house in which you were born. From these hills you looked toward Sprogo and sang in undying verse. Nowhere have roses so red a hue, and nowhere are feathers so light and blue. Nowhere the thorns so daintily grown, as those to childhood innocence known. Humorous, charming singer, we shall weave for thee a garland of woodbine and fling it into the lake, so that the current may bear it to the coast of Kjellerfjord, where your ashes rest. The tide shall bring you a greeting from the new generation, a greeting from your birthplace, Korsor, where I drop my string of pearls. That's quite right. A string of pearls does stretch from Copenhagen to Korsor, said grandmother when she had heard this read aloud. It's a string of pearls for me now, as it was more than 40 years ago. We had no railroad then. We spent days on a trip that can now be made in as many hours. That was in 1815, and I was 21, and that is a charming age. Although to be up in the 60s, that is also a wonderful age. In my young days, it was a much rarer event than it is now to come to Copenhagen, which we considered the town of all towns. My parents hadn't visited it for 20 years, but at last they were going, and I was going with them. We had talked about that journey for years before, and now it was actually coming true. It seemed as though a new life were beginning for me, and really, in a way, a new life did begin for me. There was such a bustle of sewing and packing, and when at last we were ready to start, such a crowd of friends came to bid us farewell. It was a long journey we had ahead of us. Shortly before noon, we drove out of Odense in my parents' Holstein carriage, and our friends waved to us from the windows all the way down the street, till we passed through St. Jorgen's Gate. The weather was beautiful. The birds sang, and everything was joyful. We forgot what a long and tiresome road it was to Nyborg. We reached it toward evening, but the little sailing vessel had to wait for the mail, which didn't arrive until night. Then we got on board, and as far as we could see, the wide, smooth waters lay before us. We lay down and went to sleep in our clothes. When I awoke and came on deck next morning, I could see nothing at all. A heavy fog covered everything. When I heard the cocks crowing, I knew it must be sunrise. Bells were ringing, but I didn't know where. And then the mist lifted, and we found we were still lying very close to Nyborg. Later in the day, a wind came up, but it was against us. We tacked back and forth, and at last were lucky enough to reach Korsor by a little past 11 that night, having spent 22 hours to go 16 miles. It was good to get ashore, but it was dark. The lamps were weak, and it all seemed very strange to me, who had never been in any other town but Odense. "Look," said my father, "Baggeson was born there, and Berkner lived in that house." When I heard that, somehow the dark old town with its narrow little streets seemed to grow larger and brighter. And we were so glad to feel solid earth under our feet. There was no sleep for me that night, for I was so excited over all that I had seen and heard since I had left home the day before. Next morning, we had to leave early. There was a terrible road ahead of us, with great bumps and holes as far as Slagelse, and not much better from there on, and we wanted to go to the Crab Inn early, so that on the same day we could reach Soro and visit the Molars Emil, as we called him then. Yes, he was your grandfather, my late husband, the dean. He was a student at Soro then, and had just passed his second examination. That afternoon we reached the Crab Inn, which was a gallant place at the time, the very best inn on the whole trip, with the prettiest country around it. Yes, but you must all admit that it still is. Madame Plambeck was an industrious hostess, and everything in her house was as smoothly scoured as a larding board. On the wall they had, framed under glass, Baggeson's letter to her, and it was indeed worth seeing, and I greatly enjoyed looking at it. Then he went to Soro and found Emil there. You can imagine how glad we were to see him, and he to see us. He was so thoughtful and charming. He took us to see the church and the graves of Absalon and Holberg. He inspected the old monkish inscriptions with us and sailed with us across the lake to Parnasset. It was the most wonderful evening I remember. I was thinking that to become a poet one had only to come to Soro and meditate among those lovely, peaceful scenes. By moonlight we followed the Philosopher's Walk, as it's called, the wonderful and lonely little path beside the lake that joins the highway near the Crab Inn. Emil stayed for supper with us, and my father and my mother declared he had grown so sensible and looked so well. It was almost Whitsuntide, and he promised that in a few days he would be in Copenhagen to join us and his family. Ah, those few hours in Soro and at the Crab Inn I count among the choicest pearls in my life. Next morning we again started very early, for we had a long trip to Roskilde, where we wanted to see the church, and Father wanted to visit an old school friend that evening. We spent the night in Roskilde and reached Copenhagen by noon the next day. So we had spent about 3 days on a journey that can now be made in 3 hours, Korsor to Copenhagen. The pearls on that way have not grown more costly. That could never be, but the string is new and wonderful. I stayed with my parents in Copenhagen for 3 weeks. Emil was with us for 18 whole days, and when we returned to Funen, he went with us as far as Korsør. There, before we parted, we were betrothed. So it is no wonder I should call the road from Copenhagen to Korsør a string of pearls. Afterwards, when Emil received his post at Assens, we were married. We often talked about that journey to Copenhagen and intended doing it again, but then your mother came along, and after her came her brothers and sisters, and with all of them there was so much to do and take care of. Then your grandfather was promoted and made a dean. Yes, everything was happiness and joy, but we never got to Copenhagen again. No, I've never been there since, though we often thought and talked about it. Now I'm much too old to travel by rail, but still, I'm right glad there is a railway. It's a real blessing because it brings you young ones to me more quickly. Nowadays, Odense is hardly farther from Copenhagen than in my youth it was from Nyborg. You can speed to Italy in the time it took us to reach Copenhagen. Yes, that is certainly something. It doesn't matter that I just sit here always. Let the others travel, so long as they sometimes travel to me. And you needn't laugh at me, you young people, for sitting so still here day after day. I have really a wonderful journey ahead of me. I shall soon have to travel at a speed far greater than the railways, for when our Lord calls me, I shall go to join your grandfather, and when you have completed your work on this dear earth, you too will join us. And then, if we talk over the days of our mortal life, believe me, dear children, I shall say then as I do now. From Copenhagen to Korsør is a perfect string of pearls. The Bottleneck. Close to the corner of a street, among the abodes of poverty, stood an exceedingly tall, narrow house which had been so knocked about by time that it seemed out of joint in every direction. This house was inhabited by poor people, but the deepest poverty was apparent in the garret lodging in the gable. In front of the little window, an old, bent birdcage hung in the sunshine, which had not even a proper water glass, but instead of it, the broken neck of a bottle turned upside down, and a cork stuck in to make it hold the water with which it was filled. An old maid stood at the window. She hung chickweed over the cage, and the little linnet which it contained hopped from perch to perch, and sang and twittered merrily. "Yes, it's all very well for you to sing," said the Bottleneck. That is, he did not really speak the words as we do, for the neck of a bottle cannot speak, but he thought them to himself in his own mind, just as people sometimes talk quietly to themselves. "Yes, you may sing very well. You have all your limbs uninjured. You should feel what it is like to lose your body and only have a neck and a mouth left with a cork stuck in it, as I have. You wouldn't sing then, I know. After all, it is just as well that there are some who can be happy. I have no reason to sing, nor could I sing now if I were ever so happy. But when I was a whole bottle, and they rubbed me with a cork, did I sing then? I used to be called a complete lark. I remember when I went out to a picnic with the furrier's family on the day his daughter was betrothed. It seems as if it only happened yesterday. I have gone through a great deal in my time, when I come to recollect. I have been in the fire and in the water. I have been deep in the earth and have mounted higher in the air than most other people. And now I am swinging here, outside a birdcage, in the air and the sunshine. Oh, indeed, it would be worthwhile to hear my history, but I do not speak it aloud, for a good reason, because I cannot. Then the Bottleneck related his history, which was really rather remarkable. He, in fact, related it all to himself, or at least thought it in his own mind. The little bird sang his own song merrily. In the street below, there was driving and running to and fro. Everyone thought of his own affairs, or perhaps of nothing at all. But the Bottleneck thought deeply. He thought of the blazing furnace in the factory, where he had been blown into life. He remembered how hot it felt when he was placed in the heated oven, the home from which he sprang, and that he had a strong inclination to leap out again directly, but after a while it became cooler, and he found himself very comfortable. He had been placed in a row with a whole regiment of his brothers and sisters, all brought out of the same furnace. Some of them had certainly been blown into champagne bottles, and others into beer bottles, which made little difference between them. In the world, it often happens that a beer bottle may contain the most precious wine, and a champagne bottle be filled with blacking. But even in decay, it may always be seen whether a man has been well born. Nobility remains noble, as a champagne bottle remains the same, even with blacking in its interior. When the bottles were packed, our bottle was packed amongst them. It little expected then to finish its career as a bottleneck, or to be used as a water glass to a bird's cage, which is, after all, a place of honor, for it is to be of some use in the world. The bottle did not behold the light of day again until it was unpacked with the rest in the wine merchant's cellar, and for the first time rinsed with water, which caused some very curious sensations. There it lay, empty and without a cork, and it had a peculiar feeling, as if it wanted something, but it knew not what. At last it was filled with rich and costly wine. A cork was placed in it and sealed down. Then it was labeled First Quality, as if it had carried off the first prize at an examination. Besides, the wine and the bottle were both good, and while we are young is the time for poetry. There were sounds of song within the bottle, of things it could not understand, of green sunny mountains where the vines grow, and where the merry vine dressers laugh, sing, and are merry. Ah, how beautiful is life! All these tones of joy and song in the bottle were like the working of a young poet's brain, who often knows not the meaning of the tones which are sounding within him. One morning the bottle found a purchaser in the furrier's apprentice, who was told to bring one of the best bottles of wine. It was placed in a provision basket with ham and cheese and sausages. The sweetest fresh butter and the finest bread were put into the basket by the furrier's daughter herself, for she packed it. She was young and pretty. Her brown eyes laughed, and a smile lingered round her mouth as sweet as that in her eyes. She had delicate hands, beautifully white, and her neck was whiter still. It could easily be seen that she was a very lovely girl, and as yet she was not engaged. The provision basket lay in the lap of the young girl as the family drove out to the forest, and the neck of the bottle peeped out from between the folds of the white napkin. There was the red wax on the cork, and the bottle looked straight at the young girl's face, and also at the face of the young sailor who sat near her. He was a young friend, the son of a portrait painter. He had lately passed his examination with honor as mate, and the next morning he was to sail in his ship to a distant coast. There had been a great deal of talk on this subject while the basket was being packed, and during this conversation the eyes and the mouth of the furrier's daughter did not wear a very joyful expression. The young people wandered away into the green wood and talked together. What did they talk about? The bottle could not say, for he was in the provision basket. It remained there a long time, but when at last it was brought forth, it appeared as if something pleasant had happened, for everyone was laughing. The furrier's daughter laughed too, but she said very little, and her cheeks were like two roses. Then her father took the bottle and the corkscrew into his hands. What a strange sensation it was to have the cork drawn for the first time. The bottle could never after that forget the performance of that moment. Indeed, there was quite a convulsion within him as the cork flew out, and a gurgling sound as the wine was poured forth into the glasses. "Long life to the betrothed!" cried the papa, and every glass was emptied to the dregs, while the young sailor kissed his beautiful bride. "Happiness and blessing to you both," said the old people, father and mother, and the young man filled the glasses again. "Safe return, and a wedding this day next year," he cried. And when the glasses were empty, he took the bottle, raised it on high, and said, "Thou hast been present here on the happiest day of my life. Thou shalt never be used by others." And so saying, he hurled it high into the air. The furrier's daughter thought she would never see it again, but she was mistaken. It fell among the rushes on the borders of a little woodland lake. The Bottleneck remembered well how long it lay there unseen. "I gave them wine, and they gave me muddy water," he had said to himself, "but I suppose it was all well meant." He could no longer see the betrothed couple, nor the cheerful old people, but for a long time he could hear them rejoicing and singing. At length there came by two peasant boys who peeped in among the reeds and spied out the bottle. Then they took it up and carried it home with them, so that once more it was provided for. At home in their wooden cottage, these boys had an elder brother, a sailor who was about to start on a long voyage. He had been there the day before to say farewell, and his mother was now very busy packing up various things for him to take with him on his voyage. In the evening, his father was going to carry the parcel to the town to see his son once more and take him a farewell greeting from his mother. A small bottle had already been filled with herb tea, mixed with brandy, and wrapped in a parcel. But when the boys came in, they brought with them a larger and stronger bottle, which they had found. This bottle would hold so much more than the little one, and they all said the brandy would be so good for complaints of the stomach, especially as it was mixed with the medical herbs. The liquid which they now poured into the bottle was not like the red wine with which it had once been filled. These were bitter drops, but they are of great use sometimes for the stomach. The new large bottle was to go, not the little one, so the bottle once more started on its travels. It was taken on board, for Peter Jensen was one of the crew, the very same ship in which the young mate was to sail. But the mate did not see the bottle. Indeed, if he had, he would not have known it, or supposed it was the one out of which they had drunk to the felicity of the betrothed and to the prospect of his marriage on his own happy return. Certainly the bottle no longer poured forth wine, but it contained something quite as good, and so it happened that whenever Peter Jensen brought it out, his messmates gave it the name of the apothecary, for it contained the best medicine to cure the stomach, and he gave it out quite willingly as long as a drop remained. Those were happy days, and the bottle would sing when rubbed with a cork, and it was called a great lark, Peter Jensen's lark. Long days and months rolled by, during which the bottle stood empty in a corner. When a storm arose, whether on the passage out or home, it could not tell, for it had never been ashore. It was a terrible storm. Great waves arose, darkly heaving and tossing the vessel to and fro. The main mast was split asunder, the ship sprang a leak, and the pumps became useless, while all around was black as night. At the last moment, when the ship was sinking, the young mate wrote on a piece of paper, "We are going down. God's will be done." Then he wrote the name of his betrothed, his own name, and that of the ship. Then he put the leaf in an empty bottle that happened to be at hand, corked it down tightly, and threw it into the foaming sea. He knew not that it was the very same bottle from which the goblet of joy and hope had once been filled for him, and now it was tossing on the waves with his last greeting and a message from the dead. The ship sank, and the crew sank with her. But the bottle flew on like a bird, for it bore within it a loving letter from a loving heart. And as the sun rose and set, the bottle felt as at the time of its first existence, when in the heated, glowing stove it had a longing to fly away. It outlived the storms and the calm. It struck against no rocks, was not devoured by sharks, but drifted on for more than a year, sometimes towards the north, sometimes towards the south, just as the current carried it. It was in all other ways its own master, but even of that one may get tired. The written leaf, the last farewell of the bridegroom to his bride, would only bring sorrow when once it reached her hands. But where were those hands, so soft and delicate, which had once spread the tablecloth on the fresh grass and the green wood on the day of her betrothal? Ah, yes! Where was the furrier's daughter? And where was the land which might lie nearest to her home? The bottle knew not. It traveled onward, and at last all this wandering about became wearisome. At all events, it was not its usual occupation, but it had to travel, till at length it reached land, a foreign country. Not a word spoken in this country could the bottle understand. It was a language it had never before heard, and it is a great loss not to be able to understand a language. The bottle was fished out of the water and examined on all sides. The little letter contained within it was discovered, taken out, and turned and twisted in every direction, but the people could not understand what was written upon it. They could be quite sure that the bottle had been thrown overboard from a vessel, and that something about it was written on this paper. But what was written? That was the question. So the paper was put back into the bottle, and then both were put away in a large cupboard of one of the great houses of the town. Whenever any strangers arrived, the paper was taken out and turned over and over so that the address, which was only written in pencil, became almost illegible, and at last no one could distinguish any letters on it at all. For a whole year the bottle remained standing in the cupboard, and then it was taken up to the loft, where it soon became covered with dust and cobwebs. How often then it thought of those better days, of the times when in the fresh, green wood it had poured forth rich wine, or, while rocked by the swelling waves, it had carried in its bosom a secret, a letter, a last parting sigh. For full 20 years it stood in the loft, and it might have stayed there longer but that the house was going to be rebuilt. The bottle was discovered when the roof was taken off. They talked about it, but the bottle did not understand what they said. A language is not to be learnt by living in a loft, even for 20 years. "If I had been downstairs in the room," thought the bottle, "I might have learnt it." It was now washed and rinsed, which process was really quite necessary, and afterwards it looked clean and transparent, and felt young again in its old age. But the paper, which it had carried so faithfully, was destroyed in the washing. They filled the bottle with seeds, though it scarcely knew what had been placed in it. Then they corked it down tightly and carefully wrapped it up. There, not even the light of a torch or a lantern could reach it, much less the brightness of the sun or moon. "And yet," thought the bottle, "men go on a journey that they may see as much as possible, and I can see nothing." However, it did something quite as important. It traveled to the place of its destination and was unpacked. "What trouble have they taken with that bottle over yonder?" said one. "And very likely it is broken after all." But the bottle was not broken, and better still, it understood every word that was said. This language it had heard at the furnaces and at the wine merchants, in the forest and on the ship. It was the only good old language it could understand. It had returned home, and the language was as a welcome greeting. For very joy, it felt ready to jump out of people's hands, and scarcely noticed that its cork had been drawn and its contents emptied out, till it found itself carried to a cellar, to be left there and forgotten. "There's no place like home, even if it's a cellar." It never occurred to him to think that he might lie there for years. He felt so comfortable. For many long years he remained in the cellar, till at last some people came to carry away the bottles, and ours amongst the number. Out in the garden there was a great festival. Brilliant lamps hung in festoons from tree to tree, and paper lanterns through which the light shone till they looked like transparent tulips. It was a beautiful evening, and the weather mild and clear. The stars twinkled, and the new moon, in the form of a crescent, was surrounded by the shadowy disk of the whole moon, and looked like a gray globe with a golden rim. It was a beautiful sight for those who had good eyes. The illumination extended even to the most retired of the garden walks, at least not so retired that anyone need lose himself there. In the borders were placed bottles, each containing a light, and among them the bottle with which we are acquainted, and whose fate it was, one day, to be only a bottleneck, and to serve as a water-glass to a bird's cage. Everything here appeared lovely to our bottle, for it was again in the green wood, amid joy and feasting. Again it heard music and song, and the noise and murmur of a crowd, especially in the part of the garden where the lamps blazed and the paper lanterns displayed their brilliant colors. It stood in a distant walk, certainly, but a place pleasant for contemplation, and it carried a light, and was at once useful and ornamental. In such an hour it is easy to forget that one has spent 20 years in a loft, and a good thing it is to be able to do so. Close before the bottle passed a single pair, like the bridal pair, the mate and the furrier's daughter, who had so long ago wandered in the wood. It seemed to the bottle as if he were living that time over again. Not only the guests, but other people were walking in the garden who were allowed to witness the splendor and the festivities. Among the latter came an old maid who seemed to be quite alone in the world. She was thinking, like the bottle, of the green wood and of a young betrothed pair who were closely connected with herself. She was thinking of that hour, the happiest in her life, in which she had taken part when she had herself been one of that betrothed pair. Such hours are never to be forgotten, let a maiden be as old as she may. But she did not recognize the bottle, neither did the bottle notice the old maid. And so often we pass each other in the world when we meet, as did these two, even while together in the same town. The bottle was taken from the garden, and again sent to a wine merchant, where it was once more filled with wine, and sold to an aeronaut, who was to make an ascent in his balloon on the following Sunday. A great crowd assembled to witness the sight. Military music had been engaged, and many other preparations made. The bottle saw it all from the basket in which he lay close to a live rabbit. The rabbit was quite excited, because he knew that he was to be taken up and let down again in a parachute. The bottle, however, knew nothing of the up or the down. He saw only that the balloon was swelling larger and larger till it could swell no more, and began to rise and be restless. Then the ropes which held it were cut through, and the aerial ship rose in the air with the aeronaut and the basket containing the bottle and the rabbit, while the music sounded, and all the people shouted, "Hurrah!" "This is a wonderful journey up into the air," thought the bottle. "It's a new way of sailing, and here, at least, there's no fear of striking against anything." Thousands of people gazed at the balloon, and the old maid who was in the garden saw it also, for she stood at the open window of the garret by which hung the cage containing the linnet, who then had no water-glass, but was obliged to be contented with an old cup. In the window-sill stood a myrtle in a pot, and this had been pushed a little on one side, that it might not fall out, for the old maid was leaning out of the window that she might see. And she did see distinctly the aeronaut in the balloon, and how he let down the rabbit in the parachute, and then drank to the health of all the spectators in the wine from the bottle. After doing this, he hurled it high into the air. How little she thought that this was the very same bottle which her friend had thrown aloft in her honor on that happy day of rejoicing in the green wood in her youthful days. The bottle had no time to think. When raised so suddenly, and before it was aware, it reached the highest point it had ever attained in its life. Steeples and roofs lay far, far beneath it, and the people looked as tiny as possible. Then it began to descend much more rapidly than the rabbit had done, made somersaults in the air, and felt itself quite young and unfettered, although it was half full of wine. But this did not last long. What a journey it was! All the people could see the bottle, for the sun shone upon it. The balloon was already far away, and very soon the bottle was far away also, for it fell upon a roof and broke into pieces. But the pieces had got such an impetus in them that they could not stop themselves. They went jumping and rolling about, till at last they fell into the courtyard and were broken into still smaller pieces. Only the neck of the bottle managed to keep whole, and it was broken off as clean as if it had been cut with a diamond. "That would make a capital bird's glass," said one of the cellar men. But none of them had either a bird or a cage, and it was not to be expected they would provide one just because they had found a bottleneck that could be used as a glass. But the old maid who lived in the garret had a bird, and it really might be useful to her. So the bottleneck was provided with a cork and taken up to her, and as it often happens in life, the part that had been uppermost was now turned downwards, and it was filled with fresh water. Then they hung it in the cage of the little bird, who sang and twittered more merrily than ever. "Ah, you have good reason to sing," said the bottleneck, which was looked upon as something very remarkable, because it had been in a balloon. Nothing further was known of its history. As it hung there in the bird's cage, it could hear the noise and murmur of the people in the street below, as well as the conversation of the old maid in the room within. An old friend had just come to visit her, and they talked, not about the bottleneck, but of the myrtle in the window.
"No, you must not spend $1 for your daughter's bridal bouquet,"
said the old maid.
"You shall have a beautiful little bunch for a nosegay, full of blossoms. Do you see how splendidly the tree has grown? It has been raised from only a little sprig of myrtle that you gave me on the day after my betrothal, and from which I was to make my own bridal bouquet when a year had passed. But that day never came. The eyes were closed which were to have been my light and joy through life. In the depths of the sea my beloved sleeps sweetly. The myrtle has become an old tree, and I am a still older woman. Before the sprig you gave me faded, I took a spray and planted it in the earth, and now, as you see, it has become a large tree, and a bunch of the blossoms shall at last appear at the wedding festival, in the bouquet of your daughter."
There were tears in the eyes of the old maid as she spoke of the beloved of her youth, and of their betrothal in the wood. Many thoughts came into her mind, but the thought never came that quite close to her, in that very window, was a remembrance of those olden times, the neck of the bottle which had, as it were, shouted for joy when the cork flew out with a bang on the betrothal day. But the bottleneck did not recognize the old maid. He had not been listening to what she had related, perhaps because he was thinking so much about her. The races. A prize, or rather 2 prizes, a great one and a small one, had been awarded for the greatest swiftness in running, not in a single race, but for the whole year.
"I obtained the first prize,"
said the hare.
"Justice must still be carried out, even when one has relations and good friends among the prize committee. But that the snail should have received the second prize, I consider almost an insult to myself."
"No," said the fence rail, who had been a witness at the distribution of prizes. "There should be some consideration for industry and perseverance. I have heard many respectable people say so, and I can quite understand it. The snail certainly took half a year to get over the threshold of the door, but he injured himself and broke his collarbone by the haste he made. He gave himself up entirely to the race and ran with his house on his back, which was all, of course, very praiseworthy, and therefore he obtained the second prize."
"Well, I think I ought to have some consideration, too," said the swallow. "I should imagine that no one can be swifter in soaring and flight than I am, and how far I have been, far, far away."
"Yes, that is your misfortune," said the fence rail. "You are so fickle, so unsettled. You must always be traveling about into foreign lands when the cold commences here. You have no love of fatherland in you. There can be no consideration for you."
"But now, if I have been lying the whole winter in the moor," said the swallow, "and suppose I slept the whole time, would that be taken into account?"
"Bring a certificate from the old moorhead," said he, "that you have slept away half of your time in fatherland. Then you will be treated with some consideration."
"Well, I deserved the first prize, and not the second," said the snail. "I know so much, at least, that the hare only ran from cowardice, and because he thought there was danger in delay. I, on the other hand, made running the business of my life, and have become a cripple in the service. If anyone had a first prize, it ought to have been myself. But I do not understand chattering and boasting. On the contrary, I despise it." And the snail spat at them with contempt.
"I am able to affirm with word of oath that each prize, at least those for which I voted, was given with just and proper consideration," said the old boundary post in the wood, who was a member of the committee of judges. "I always act with due order, consideration, and calculation. 7 times have I already had the honor to be present at the distribution of the prizes and to vote, but today is the first time I have been able to carry out my will. I always reckon the first prize by going through the alphabet from the beginning, and the second by going through from the end. Be so kind as to give me your attention, and I will explain to you how I reckon from the beginning. The 8th letter from A is H. And there we have H for hare. Therefore, I awarded the hare the first prize. The eighth letter from the end of the alphabet is S, and therefore the snail received the second prize. Next year, the letter I will have its turn for the first prize, and the letter R for the second.
I should really have voted for myself, said the mule. If I had not been one of the judges on the committee, not only the rapidity with which advance is made, but every other quality should have due consideration, as, for instance, how much weight a candidate is able to draw. But I have not brought this quality forward now, nor the sagacity of the hare in its flight, nor the cunning with which he suddenly springs aside and doubles to lead people on a false track, thinking he has concealed himself. No, there is something else on which more stress should be laid, and which ought not to be left unnoticed. I mean that which mankind call the beautiful. It is on the beautiful that I particularly fix my eyes. I observed the well-grown ears of the hare. It is a pleasure for me to observe how long they are. It seemed as if I saw myself again in the days of my childhood, and so I voted for the hare.
Bzzz, said the fly.
There, I'm not going to make a long speech, but I wish to say something about hares. I have really overtaken more than one hare. When I have been seated on the engine in front of a railway train, I often do so. One can say then so easily judge of one's own swiftness. Not long ago, I crushed the hind legs of a young hare. He had been running a long time before the engine. He had no idea that I was traveling there. And at last, he had to stop in his career, and the engine ran over his hind legs and crushed them, for I sat upon it. I left him lying there and rode on farther. I call that conquering him, but I do not want the prize.
It really seems to me,
thought the wild rose, though she did not express her opinion aloud. It is not in her nature to do so, though it would have been quite as well if she had.
It certainly seems to me that the Sunbeam ought to have had the honor of receiving the first prize. The Sunbeam flies in a few minutes along the immeasurable path from the sun to us. It arrives in such strength that all nature awakes to loveliness and beauty. We roses blush and exhale fragrance in its presence. Our worshipful judges don't appear to have noticed this at all. Were I the Sunbeam, I would give each one of them a sunstroke, but that would only make them mad, and they are mad enough already. I only hope,
continued the rose,
that peace may reign in the wood. It is glorious to bloom, to be fragrant, and to live in story and in song. The Sunbeam will outlive us all.
What is the prize? Asked the earthworm, who had overslept the time and only now came up.
It contains a free admission to the cabbage garden, replied the mule. I proposed that as one of the prizes. The hare most decidedly must have it, and I, as an active and thoughtful member of the committee, took special care that the prize should be one of advantage to him, so now he is provided for. The snail can now sit on the fence and lick up moss and sunshine. He has also been appointed one of the first judges of swiftness in racing. It is worth much to know that one of the members is a man of talent in the thing men call a committee. I must say
I expect much in the future. We have already made such a good beginning. Well, thank you once again for showing up and listening to this installment of the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This is volume 21. That means that we have already over 21 hours of fairy tales from the works of Hans Christian Andersen. We hope that you've been enjoying it. There's much more to come from his vast library of work. Take care of yourselves out there. Sweet dreams.